Welcome to another HoPIN event. My name's John Hinks. I'm the coordinator of HoPIN and I'm chairing the session this evening. We have 8 speakers. They are going to speak for exactly 7.5 minutes each, on pain of death if they go over. We then have, at the end of all the talks, we have roughly half an hour for discussion. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box at any time. Please don't use the chat box for questions. Use the Q&A box. You can use chat to contact individuals if you want to. If we don't get all the questions done at the end, the speakers have agreed to have the list of questions by email, and we'll deal with them accordingly. But with any luck, we'll get the questions all in. So let's begin straight away with our first speaker, who is Ines Vodopivec from the National and University Library of Slovenia. She is starting us off with some festive peasants, small evidences of everyday life, decorative borders with festive peasants by Hans Holbein the Younger. Ines, over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you everybody to giving me this opportunity to be the part of this very interesting event, or let's say marathon.
Yeah.
Please excuse my English. I'm Slavic, so I'm very working very hard on pronouncing the words right. So today I'm going to talk about festive peasants in printed decorative elements of 16th century books. I will share my screen now. Hope you'll see this. Do you see it? Hopefully. Okay. Just a second. Full screen. Okay. Is it full screen, John? Is it full screen? Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So, scenes from everyday life are collectively known as genre painting. These scenes enjoyed enormous popularity in European Northern Renaissance from the 16th century forward. The foundations of the genre were laid most remarkably by the great Flemish painter Peter Bruegel the Elder. Especially his scenes of peasant life are very well known to us. They encompass lively depictions such as weddings or village fairs. But genre and peasant motifs are not represented only in painted Renaissance works. Printed books of the 16th century are full of different genre motifs used in decorative elements or illustrations. And a variety of depictions represented peasants can be found as central depictions of printed decorative borders or initials. Their origin can be traced back to the Duc de Berry richly decorated Book of Hours. Most examples of such peasant genre are printed in Basel already at the end of the 15th century. But afterwards, they also appear in French, Flemish, and German prints. In printed Italian production of the 16th century, the motifs with farmers are very rare or they don't exist at all. Some of the genre motifs are also representations of biblical references, for example, the ones corresponding to the passages of Jesus calling to the 4 fishermen. Among the more prominent representatives using peasants in book decoration is also Hans Holbein the Younger, who made few initial series and decorative borders on the theme. The ones that are today kept in our National and University Library in Slovenia were printed in Basel between the years 1523 and 1546. In his depictions, Peasants are represented in realistic and simple form, depicted in scenes from everyday life. Here you can see different representations of works from the 12 months. Iconographic origins of the motifs can also be related to the manuscript tradition. As I said, the iconography is mostly related to the 12 months depictions or farm chores. His other motifs display peasant festives, most probably related to absurd and obscene texts with satirical depictions of folly. But there were also different interpretations of the motifs used by Holbein in these decorative borders, such as depicting the seasons of the year. For example, you have spring on the lower decorative border, summer on the left border, autumn on the right border, and winter on the upper border. But of course, this is not the proper order of the borders. They're shifting from one side to another. The upper border could be related to fox or goose hunting if printed, and it was actually used and printed separately. And also the lower border could be the depiction of peasants' wedding dance when it was also used separately and printed in books separately, which actually occurred in a few times. But all borders also contain hints to possible festive celebrations known from the ancient times, like Brumalia or Saturalia. These came from the pre-Christian period to the medieval festivals, and finally with carnival masks, also to the Renaissance folk dances. But as I said at the beginning, it is also possible that the motifs of the Holbein festive peasants originate from Renaissance obscure texts where folk madness and foolishness can be found, especially in Erasmus' praise of folly, which was very well known to Holbein. As we can see, he also made some illustrations to it. Where Erasmus mentions peasant behavior on festivals and carnivals. Already at the beginning of the praise of folly, Erasmus refers to foolishness of selecting and appointing folk green king of the parade and others who dance, drink, and play the flute. The green king or prince seen in the middle of the upper border is also known as personification of spring. But he also has his counterpart in a woman figure in the lower episode. Peasant dance is depicted also in another book printed in Basel in 1555, but there is no evidence that the initial was printed by Holbein. So, to conclude, regardless of which theory is or could be the right one, it is self-evident that Holbein used and depicted peasant motifs of everyday life in printed decoration. One might just wonder, what stimulated him to do so? Was it the connection of man with the yearly seasons? Or was the madness of festivals happening in his own town? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ines. That was really interesting, and you certainly don't need to worry about your English. It's fine. Okay. Moving on swiftly, our next speaker, second speaker, is Rachel Singel, University of Louisville. She has a BA from University of Virginia and an MA in Fine Arts in Printmaking from University of Iowa, and she's an associate professor at Louisville. She's going to talk to us about recycling nature, printing on papers made with invasive plants, sustainable fibres, and recycled materials. Over to you, Rachel.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, John, and thank you for this opportunity. It's very wonderful to be here. So let me share my screen here. Let's see. Share screen. Da, da, da. Okay. Let's see. Can everybody see that? No. Let's see. Share. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen? Or
Yes.
No?
Yeah.
Okay. Great, great. Thank you for confirming that. Okay. All right. Well, let's get started. So hello again, my name is Rachel Singel, and the title of my talk is Recycling Nature, Printing on Papers Made from Invasive Plants, Sustainable Fibers, and Recycled Materials. During this presentation, I'm going to discuss my personal research, but we'll begin with a brief synopsis of the history of paper. A Chinese court official named Kai Lun is traditionally regarded as the innovator of paper in 105 AD, or inventor of paper in 105 AD, using the bark of trees, hemp, old rags, and fishing nets. Paper making spread to the Islamic regions by the 8th century, where its production was partially mechanized with water-powered mills that used hammers to beat the rags and hemp into pulp. By the 14th century, there were paper mills in several parts of Europe, as the invention of the printing press in about 1450 greatly increased the demand for paper. Through the 18th century, the paper making process remained essentially unchanged, with linen and cotton rags as the basic raw materials. However, as the demand for paper grew, the mills changed to using fiber from trees because wood was less expensive and more abundant than cloth. Now, I would like to begin to share my own research with paper making. As a printmaker, I first began to make paper with my old prints. I started by sanding down the imagery and recycled the dust to form sheets. Now, let me go back. I could not print on these sheets because the short fibers did not yield very strong paper. So, in order to make stronger sheets that I could use for my work, I started making paper using plant fibers with Eastern paper making techniques. The three most traditional fibers used are kozo, gampi, and mitsumata, because these plants have long fibers. To make the paper, the bark must first be removed, the dark outer bark scraped off, the white inner bark cooked in a weak soda ash solution, and then the fibers beaten by hand. On this paper, I was able to print my copper plates and even make books. Here are some examples of the many etchings I printed on the handmade paper. There's one, another, and another. So these papers were so strong that I could even recycle prints that I considered unsuccessful for wrapping boxes, as well as books. So as you can imagine, I made a lot of books. Now, my work with invasive plants began when I received a residency at Bernheim Research Forest in Kentucky in 2018. Because the forest was overrun with tree of heaven, an invasive species, I decided to collect it and use it to make my paper. There's the process. Even after cooking, the fiber was too tough to beat by hand, so I consulted my paper making mentor, Timothy Barrett, and he recommended putting it in arena beater, a traditional style beater like those made in Holland in the 1600s. However, because these fibers were put in the beater and thus were shortened, I added to the batch cotton and abaca, a species of banana plant, to strengthen the sheets as well as lighten the color for printing. To make the paper, the pulp is put into a vat with water and formation aid to help suspend the fibers. A mold is dipped into the mixture, lifted, and allowed to drain. What is left in the surface is couched, from the French coucher, to lie, onto a wet felt, and then eventually pressed to remove excess water. I made 3 batches, one of pure tree of heaven, one with added abaca, and one with cotton. I was able to print on these sheets successfully. The fibers were very strong, and I was able to print on sheets that were incredibly thin. Other sustainable fibers that I've been making paper with include jute, which is eco-friendly and sustainable because it needs little to no intervention to grow and replenish. Another example. I have most recently begun making paper with another invasive plant from a pond in Virginia, yellow flag iris. Because I'm also beating this plant in the beater, the resulting paper is extremely brittle. Due to its dark color, I've become experimenting with longer washing times, and as I move forward, I plan to supplement the batches of yellow flag iris with Abaca to strengthen future sheets. And that's the conclusion to my presentation. So thank you so much for your time.
Bingo.
Thank you. That was excellent, Rachel. Thank you. It's really good to hear from someone who's actually practically involved in printmaking, because most of us are, many of us are academics and don't actually do much. I do a little bit of dabbling myself, but I'm certainly not a proper printmaker. So that's great. Thank you very much indeed. Right, moving on, we have Richard Minsky. Richard is at the Center for Book Arts in New York, which he actually founded in 1974 in New York City. And he's also a laureate of the American Printing History Association. He's going to talk to us. He has the intriguing title of New Tricks for Old Dogs. I'm not sure exactly what that's about, so we shall find out. Over to you, Richard.
Hi, everybody. I'm also a practitioner. I make books, I print them, and I bind them. And so I started collecting books. Let's see if we can share the screen here. Okay, is that sharing to everybody? Yes? Okay, I'm going to assume everybody can see this. And what does it mean, new tricks for old dogs? Well, they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but this old dog had to learn some new ones. Here you see an 1876 book cover. Now, if I can just get that to work. It's amazing how three-dimensional it looks. How is this printed? How do they get that astounding effect? And when you hold that book, it shimmers in the light. As you walk past it in a bookstore or hold it in your hand, the whole thing glitters. And the engraving die was hand done for stamping the cover. You see all of these lines that go to all different angles. When you take a burr and you cut the brass for the die, it makes a V shape, and that reflects the gold at different angles off of the V. So by controlling the angle that you cut it at, you control how it glitters. Now, as they get to the 1880s, you see more and more books that use an effect like this in the age of photo engraving. And they were able to, with a single stamping and without hand engraving, they were able to create these effects. So you see in these images on the covers, you can see how they go light and dark. And if you move the light, you'll see it go from one side to the other. It could be used in images that are not just abstract, like those decorative images. And although this is decorative, you see there's a ship on the water, and it looks like the water's reflecting the sunlight. So how do they achieve that effect without hand engraving? Here's another one. Thomas Watson Ball was great at doing the water and doing effects of sky, creating an amazing, brilliant effect that would make people want to pick up the book in the bookstore. That's really the effect that is wanted, is for people to buy the book, and that's why these were done. So here you see the same cover lit from two different angles, and you see the opposite vines light up in each direction, and in one, the center panel goes lighter, and one, it goes darker. And what they did instead of hand engraving is they'd use mezzo tint or aqua tint or a steel roller or a punch to create different textures, and that would create a matte or bright effect. So my question became, what do I do today? I collected hundreds, actually thousands of these, and I built up collections, and I issued catalogs of American decorated publishers' bindings from that period. So for my first volume on that subject, I took this cover, which we believe Bruce Rogers designed, which was flat gold. And I scanned it and made it all black in Photoshop. And then I added textures in Photoshop to create that effect. And this became the cover of my first catalog. That's the paper cover on my limited edition. There's also a deluxe edition in cloth. But I took that same image when George Braziller asked me to make a trade book, a gift book format trade book. I just squashed that image in Photoshop to fit the shape of this new book, which is the 21st century way of doing this 19th century effect, skipping that messy century in the middle. And you see how effective it is. Here's another one. I did a collection of Amelia Barr's books because the great covers were done on her books because she was such a popular author who most people don't know. That's another story. But William Snelling Hathaway designed this cover for Prisoners of Conscience. The publisher would tell a designer, you have, for example, 2 colors and gold, and you could use so much gold, because it was all a financial question of how much could they invest in a particular book, had to do with expected sales. Now, I didn't really particularly like the black ocean. It took away from the silhouette of the sea. So I decided to make the water blue and give it more depth because I didn't have that constraint. In those days, the color was printed on a Colt's Armory press, or Universal Press, another name for it, very powerful platen press that was developed in the 1870s. That's when you started seeing color on book covers because it was strong enough to actually crush the cloth fibers. So I printed the color on an Epson inkjet printer, the one right over here. And what I did in order to get the registration, I don't know if you can see this, but I printed little dots in the corners of my panel. And then I made a jig with pins, pin registration like we used to use on the hand press in the 15th century in order to register the gold with the printer. So the advantage of doing panels is I could do different, here's an alum toad goatskin binding using the same panel. I just made one like that for University of Rochester because they bought the whole collection. I'll just finish up with this picture. One of the things that they could do with a Colt's Armory press, instead of having an ink disc on the platen press, it had a series of horizontal rollers that was cylindrical with an oscillating roller to distribute it. Somebody got the clever idea of putting a divider in the ink fountain so you could split the fountain and blend the colors. And here with just 2 printings, you see it goes from an orange to a blue and from a blue to a light blue and gold. 2 colors in gold got that great effect. Thank you.
Thanking Richard for an excellent talk, and thanking all the speakers so far for keeping well to time. And we press on with Cathy Ferguson, who is from the University of Hawaii, where she teaches political theory and women's studies. She's going to talk about an anarchist printer, I don't know how you pronounce his name, Joseph Ishill maybe, and the Oriole press. So over to you, Cathy.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I'm really pleased to be included in this quite interesting event. Can you all see my slides? Picture of Joseph Ishill? Great, thank you. Joseph Ishill is the printer that I'm focusing on for my talk today. This is a woodcut by the French anarchist engraver Louise Moreau. Ishill was born in 1888 in Romania. He apprenticed as a printer at age 14, became attracted to anarchist ideas as a young man. He immigrated to the United States in 1909, lived for a time at the anarchist community in Stelton, New Jersey. He married the poet and translator Rose Freeman Ishill, and at Stelton he taught printing at the school as well as printed their journal, the Modern School Magazine. In 1919, he built a bungalow for himself and his family outside Berkeley Heights, New Jersey, and established the Oriole Press. He printed over 200 books and pamphlets and kept many anarchist press from going out of print. He never sold his books. He freely gave them away. Ishill died in 1966, and he left his press to a Holy Order of Dominican nuns. This woodcut by Louise Moreau, Moreau illustrated many of Ishill's books. He was apprenticed as a lithographer and later became a painter and a wood engraver. He contributed to many anarchist journals aside from Ishill, and he was considered Ishill's partner, both in their understanding of their politics and in their aesthetic goals and their publishing ventures. I became interested in Joseph Ishill because I am writing a book on the role of letterpress printers in the anarchist movement from the Paris Commune to the Spanish Revolution. This book is coming out with Duke University Press next year. It's called Letterpress Revolution, The Politics of Anarchist Print Culture. While Ishill was widely called the anarchist printer, there were in fact many hundreds of anarchist printers. It was one of the most common trades in the anarchist movement, along with textiles and mining. Printers and presses, I've found, were part of the glue that held the movement together. The many printers in the movement were both professionals like Ishill and also amateurs who learned the trade in order to help put out the journals. There were many hundreds of anarchist journals. Anarchists had a lot of small journals rather than a smaller number of widely circulated ones. So basically every local group put out a journal, so that meant they needed a printer. And the making of all those journals was central to the making of the movement. Okay, this is a two pages from Ishill's book, Open Vistas. And what I'm going to focus on here is what I've learned from Bonnie Mack's book, How the Page Matters, the concept of the architecture of the page. And the idea is to think of the page as a series of possible spaces in which every space is printed, every bit of surface, regardless of whether it has any typographical marks on it, because the printer, of course, has to decide how it will be used. And what Mack argues is that pages remain persuasive through time through the printer's orchestration of the text, the images, the graphic markers, the ink, the receiving surface, and blank space. And she calls this, quote, a changing interplay of form and content, of message and medium, of the conceptual and the physical. Pages host both material and rhetorical strategies, as she succinctly states, quote, the page is entangled with the story. So the images in Ishill's work participate with his text in configuring the available meanings and inviting and guiding the readers through the text offered terrain. So you can see that Ishill uses generous margins on all around, but especially on the right-hand side and the bottom, in order to let the text and the reader breathe, and to, as he commented, keep the text from looking like it was trying to escape the page. The illuminated enlarged initial letter at the beginning of the first line marks the point of entry, of course, but also draws the reader in, invites the reader to join the text. Every essay has an introductory image to it, and well, not everyone, but most of them. And this is again from Louise Moreau, and this is Ishill's book. He printed Elie Reclus's Plant Physiognomies. It's one of the most beautifully orchestrated and illustrated books of his corpus. So this prepares the reader for the coming reading experience. The small markers, which I understand are called fleurons, these little delicate ornaments that separate the articles, mark transitions, and also encourage the reader to pause before going on to the next essay. And the colophons at the end, where the printer's mark is left on the final page. This again was Louise Moreau's making of a colophon for Ishill. And you're looking through a window at a printer who is setting type. And of course, there's the orange bird on the windowsill. That's the Oriole of the Oriole press. Okay, I'll just finish with this image. I want to talk a bit about Ishill's pedagogy. He organizes his pages, the images and the text, to slow down the process of reception and direct the reader's attention to cultivate the reader's judgment. There are many directions to go in Ishill's work, unlike many anarchist publications, which are kind of relentless. These invite wandering, returning, pausing, skipping ahead. He dramatizes his text to intervene in the reader's practice of recognition. He recomposes elements of situations to make new situations and redistribute the assets of the discursive formations in which the journal and the readers participated. Ishill's works have a version of what book historian Franz Janssen called expressive strength, a compelling link between the text's outward appearance and its meanings. Anarchists, as I'm sure you know, were widely regarded as loathsome and barbaric. Joseph Ishill made anarchism beautiful. He created scenes that close the gap between craft and art. He takes a step toward a world in which workers would not be alienated from the product or the process of their labor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cathy. That was great. Some very interesting things in there that certainly relate to some things I've worked on some years ago now on radical printers in this country, the UK, and how involved they were in printing and book selling and all sorts of book-related things. Okay, we're halfway through. And we're keeping pretty much to time, which is excellent. Can I just remind everyone to put questions and answers in the Q&A box? Feel free to type them in at any time. When we get to the end of all the talks, I'll read out questions to the various speakers. So we press on to our fifth speaker, who is Paul Nash. Paul is a librarian, bibliographer, and printing historian. And he's the editor of the Journal of the Printing Historical Society. And he's going to talk to us about dabbing, which he describes as an ancient-ish method of duplicating woodcuts. Paul.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for having me today. I'll share my screen with luck. That's looking promising. Can you see that okay? Right. Dabbing was one of the English names for a simple method of reproducing woodcuts and wood engravings during the hand press period. In English, the process was also called polytyping and cliché or clichage, all of which names derive from French usage. What I'm going to do is tell you very briefly how it worked, illustrated with some of my own attempts, how it was used in the 18th and 19th centuries, and how it may have been used in the earlier period. The technique was first described, hang on, I'm having trouble getting my slide to advance. Let's try that. There we are. The technique was first described in a little handbook, Kurze doch nützliche Anleitung von Form- und Stahlschneiden, a brief but handy guide to block and punch cutting, published at Erfurt in 1740 as part of the celebrations for the notional tercentenary of the invention of printing by Gutenberg in 1440. The author was probably the printer and publisher Johann Michael Funke. It is a fascinating work which provides detailed instructions on cutting woodblocks and steel punches, and on casting woodblocks in 3 ways, using sand casting, plaster casting, and by dabbing. A facsimile with an introduction by James Moseley was published in 1998. Funke says that the woodblock, which must not be undercut, is first rubbed over with a solution of red ochre. Then a tray is made with a piece of writing paper, also coated with red ochre, and placed on a board. Type metal is melted and a small quantity poured into the paper tray. The block is then picked up in both hands and pressed evenly into the molten metal just as it's about to freeze. This should produce a matrix, which can then be dressed and filed and sanded to make it thin and even. It should then be coated with a protective layer of red ochre, red lead, or hardwood smoke. Next, Funke describes making the only item of special equipment he deems necessary for the process. This is a turned wooden handle with a brass bush on one end, which fits together with a series of wooden discs of different sizes, each with a screw thread in the middle. The matrix is attached to the middle of the disc with a little flour and water paste, and a puddle of molten type metal is poured onto a sheet of paper smeared with red ochre. Then the matrix is smacked down sharply into the molten metal, again just as it's about to freeze. After a few seconds, the metal is hard enough for the matrix and casting to be separated, and the result is a close copy of the original block, raised in the middle of a sheet of flat metal, and this can be trimmed and mounted on a wooden block for use. The advantages of this method over plaster and sand casting are that the same matrix can be used many times and the process can be quickly repeated. After 1740, there is ample evidence for the use of the technique for making printing blocks, including some of the blocks themselves. Johannes Enschede was selling examples to other printers by 1750, and a German catalogue of cast ornaments was published in 1764. In 1786, William Caslon III issued the first English catalogue as specimens of cast ornaments on a new plan. Although Caslon used a slightly different method for making his matrices, he cut masters in brass and then they were driven into blocks of lead to make the matrices, and then multiple copies were then cast by dabbing, quite possibly using a dabbing box like this. Remarkably, the original blocks made for this catalogue, as well as this later dabbing box, survive in the Stevenson Blake archive. In France, after the Revolution, dabbing was used to create multiple printing surfaces for the assignats. Now, I must ask you to forgive my pronunciation. I have no idea how to pronounce this word. Assignats, I'm going to say. These were bonds issued by the Revolutionary Assembly between 1789 and 1795. These had to be printed in vast numbers, estimated at more than 1 billion individual notes, in a short period, and in order to achieve this, a dabbing machine was manufactured to automate and render precisely vertical the downward thump of the matrix into the molten metal. A similar machine was patented in 1818 by the English inventor of presses and printing equipment Augustus Applegath. This was intended primarily for copying pages of set type rather than blocks, which is of course another possible use of dabbing as an alternative to stereotyping by the plaster or flong methods. In 1841, William Savage described what he called polytyping in his Dictionary of the Art of Printing, when he compared the results with those achieved by the new process of electrotyping. So that's an original engraving on wood. That's the polytyped or dabbed copy. There's the engraving on wood again, and there is the electrotype copy, which is rather better. The electrotype was a truer facsimile of the original woodblock, and one might have expected electrotyping to kill dabbing, and indeed it did, but it didn't do so at once, and some blocks were still being sold as polytyped copies until the last 2 decades of the 19th century. But how far back can dabbing be traced? I have not found any evidence of its use before Funke's account of 1740, but there is plenty of evidence for the use of cast ornaments, and I think it likely that some of these at least were produced by dabbing, rather than the other possible techniques of sand casting, plaster casting, or casting from a paper flong. It's often impossible to tell whether an image has been printed from a woodblock or from a cast copy. However, when an impression shows damage to a line, which is different in a metal block from a wooden one, or the obvious heads of nails used to mount the cast, a metal surface can be assumed. Here are some examples from before 1740. And in this one, you can see nail heads visible here and here, and they've actually been engraved over in an attempt to conceal them. This is an earlier block from 1647, a tailpiece, and again you can see the heads of nails or pins here, here, and here. Going back in time, 1600, this is a very common tailpiece or title page ornament seen all over Europe, and I suspect it was sold, many copies were sold in the form of a dabbed casting, and you can see nail heads here, 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 and here, and you can see them in other positions on other copies of this block. This is an eye that was used by Adam Islip in London between 1590 and 1606, and it would sometimes appear twice in the same form, so he must have had more than one copy of this eye, which are bibliographically identical. They must have been, one must have been cast from the other, or they were both from a master. And then in 1606, Adam Islip sold all his stock and set up again. He bought a new set of eyes, and then these 3 eyes occur after 1607. And again, all 3 derive from the same master, but they're all 3 clearly different blocks because they all have different damage, not to say different signs of nailhead presence. This factotum was used by Joseph Barnes at Oxford in 1585, and I think this one is the original woodblock. It's very small, it's about 3 centimeters tall, And this is probably a cast from it. And you can tell that it's from the same master, because even though the border is damaged in a different way, this bit of damage on the arm of the cherub here is the same as this bit here, so they must derive from the same master block. And finally, going back all the way to 1496, this block is Richard Pinson's device, and in 1510 it looked like this. It had been damaged at the foot here, and this sort of damage must be to a metal block. You can't do that with a woodcut. It doesn't bend like that. Wood doesn't bend. And you've also got nail heads here and here, so at least this outer border must have been a metal cut, or at least a metal cast by 1510. It's surprising how often one finds this evidence. While we cannot be certain that these casts were made by dabbing, of course, we can be certain that they were casts. Another possibility which we should consider is that there is some evidence that designs were simply cut onto metal rather than wood. Such metal cuts may sometimes have looked very like woodcuts, and could show the same nail heads, bends, etc., which indicate that metal was used. However, I think it's impossible for a woodcut artist to copy another block perfectly by hand, and where one observes multiple examples of the same design, some clearly printed from metal without any differences in the design itself, as in the case of Adam Islip's I, the metal surfaces observed must have been cast, and the most likely method, I think, of casting was dabbing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was extremely interesting. I knew nothing about dabbing, and now I do. So thank you. Thank you for that. Moving on, our next speaker is Brian Alderson, who is an authority on children's books, children's literature, and has a particular interest in the illustration of children's books. And Brian is going to talk to us about Esop on the Grid. Over to you, Brian.
This is a single etched plate from a collection of Aesop's fables that was made by Samuel Richardson in 1740. He wrote 240 fables, but illustrated them with 120 etched plates of this kind. And as you see, there are 10 images to the plate. So 10 times 24 makes 240. There was also, in fact, an extra plate illustrating Aesop's life, which also had 10 etchings on it. The etchings are numbered, so they correspond to the numbers of the fables, and they are really rather charming and well made, but very small narrative images. The book, I think, was something of a success, and next plate will show us that in 1764, Robert Dodsley, at the end of his life, also produced a fable book, the famous Select Fables, which was in fact printed in Birmingham by Baskerville and was illustrated again by these plates in what I would call a grid. I don't know whether he knew of the earlier example, but certainly here he greatly improved upon the style. There were altogether about 19 plates, some of them varying in quantity, but most of them of 12 images etched by Grignon after Whale, who also supplied decorations to the book, which rather a handsome affair altogether. Later on, though, the Dodsley firms, Dodsley himself died soon after doing this book. The Dodsley firm went on and decided to do a cheap edition of it. Now, there they removed themselves from the grid system, and in order to save money, they went back to wood engraving. Now, if we could see firstly one of these images by itself, may we? Yes, here, this is the top left one from ours, and you can see that they were putting a lot more care into the design of the roundel within that collection of surrounding lines. But for the wood engraved edition, they used the same pictures, but in single images. Could we have the next one? Oh dear, no, that's number 7. No. Oh, there you had it. These trees. This is the fable of the trees and the bramble, and then you get in the cheap edition the whole thing converted into a wood engraving. Have you got that there? I saw it a moment ago. There we go. So this is a single framed wood engraving next to the text of the fable. So by doing this, he's able to print the whole book from a single letterpress printer without having to revert here and there to etching presses. So it was a good means, really, of saving money in repeating the book. The technique here of converting your etched image to a wood engraving was interestingly reversed a little bit later. This is number 5. Sorry, number 6, where we have, in fact, I hope, we've got an etched drawing at the head of letterpress text. Yes, here we are. Oh, this is an unsigned etching based on a drawing by the famous painter William Mulready, and it was in a collection of 71 fables written by William Godwin for the very first children's book that he published when he set himself up in 1805 as a publisher. Mulready was very young at that time, and Godwin employed him for many of his projects. But in this case, he was publishing a rather expensive book. Godwin was always broke, so expensive books were rather difficult for him to deal with. And in fact, he decided in 1805 to do a cheap edition of his fables in a single volume. The others were all in 2 volumes. So we could perhaps see that when he reverted to this single volume, he reverted to the grid system. You should have a full plate of a no, that's the last one. The one, yes, this is the one of 8 etched plates which were otherwise incorporated in a single letterpress volume. And what is interesting here is that the images on the grid are in fact minute replicas of the drawings by Valredi in the main book. You can see this interestingly by our last slide, which will show you, well, that is the painting. The last slide will show you that painting reduced into just one of those little things. And you'll see that they have rather remarkably managed to catch all the elements of Mulready's drawing. So it reverses the procedures that we saw with the previous examples from Dodsley. Sorry about the muck-up, but then, as I say, PowerPoint is not my big thing, but I love to see everybody else's work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. That was great. I'm glad to see you still active and pursuing your many interests. Right, we have 2 speakers left. The next one we have is Georgina Grant. Is that right? Yeah, Georgina Grant. Georgina is a senior curator at the Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust here in Shropshire in England, where she manages the library and archives and the collections team, but she's actually currently undertaking a research fellowship called the Headley Fellowship, funded by the Art Fund. And Georgina is going to talk to us about, quote, putting electrodes away, a day in the life of the photographer at the Coalbrookdale Ironworks. Over to Georgina.
Oh, thank you. Evening, everyone. I will just share my screen. Which I assume everyone can see. Excellent, thank you. So I'm going to talk about the photographer at the Coalbrookdale Company Ironworks. And one of the reasons I wanted to be a part of this is I'm hoping for some leads or connections if anyone has other examples of photographers working in a business context in the 19th century. As so far I haven't had much luck in finding comparisons, and so far I don't know of any other ironworks that had a similar type of setup with a photographer. I will start with just a brief background to the ironworks, known as the Coalbrookdale Company. Our tagline is that they were the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution and made engineering products such as bridges and locomotives, but they also made a large amount of decorative and architectural items like verandas, railings, and gates. The company at one time was the largest ironworks in the world, employing around 3,500 men. We know that Coalbrookdale had a photographer on the team since, well, at least as early as 1855, and that there was a dedicated photographic studio from at least 1862. We have this plan of the headquarters of the ironworks in 1912. And you can see, so if you look at the bottom right corner of the main image, that is the photograph room. And I've just enlarged that on the side, but you might be able to make out that it says photo room, and you can even see the little area dedicated for the dark room. What is quite nice is that the museum, we still use these offices as our headquarters today. So I can show you a picture of what that room looks like. And I think quite fittingly, it's where our marketing team sit today. So about a year ago, we discovered one of the photographer's work diaries, which shed light on that role. It belonged to a chap called Will Hewitt. He was born in Coalbrookdale in 1862, and he spent his entire working life at the ironworks. And in the census records, he's described as both a lithographer and a photographer. And this is where he lived. It was called Naylor's Row. And you can see his signature just at the bottom of the image. And this is the work diary. So it really shows, he details what he does every single day. And it seems that the role largely deals with all forms of printed material relating to the ironworks. Work would have started at 6 a.m. and you would have been fined or even dismissed if you were late. And he went to work every day apart from Sundays. His diary entries, they're quite brief, but the activities cover photographing new iron products, printing blueprints, printing and toning photographs, taking care of printing blocks and glass plate negatives, and answering inquiries from clients and agents who wanted photos or catalogue pages of the latest Coalbrookdale products. But to go through some of these in just a little bit more detail. Will Hewitt, he would have taken a photograph of every single item that was being made at the ironworks, and alongside that he would have printed out design registration papers, and essentially those two activities prevented plagiarism amongst the competing ironworks. He also took pictures of the ironworks and the workers themselves. So the first image you saw, he would have taken that photo. Will was also responsible for the printing blocks, some of which are shown here. They were used for printing Coalbrookdale's catalogues and other advertising material, and he also used them to answer specific questions from clients about products. But I'm not sure, some of these would have been printed on site, but largely I think they were sent away for printing. There's still a question around whether these would have been produced at the site. I've found very little evidence to say that they were. I think largely external engravers were used. Either way, Will, he steadfastly notes in his diary when he takes the printing blocks out of the cupboard and when he puts them back in. And sometimes this can take him all day. The blocks would have been stored in their own filing system. And I know this because we have about 1,000 of these blocks in the collection, and each one is numbered in ink by hand. Will also spent a lot of time printing blueprints. You can see an example here. And these blueprints were a vital part of the ironworks. They are a copy of a draftsman's drawing. And then this would have been sent to a client, such as an architect or a builder. They would have looked at the specification and the construction details, made any amendments and sent them back to the works. And these blueprints would have also been used at the ironworks themselves in the workshops. And I know this because some of them are still quite filthy. You can tell they've come from the foundry floor. This blueprint, just out of interest, is for a cast iron spiral staircase, and you can see it also has a photograph. And this one was shipped to Japan in 1904. Sadly, we don't have any pictures of Will Hewitt because he was always behind the camera. So I'll end with this photo, which he would have taken. It was taken around 1900 on payday at the works, which is why there are so many men depicted. But I hope that gives you a brief glimpse into the life of the photographer at the ironworks. And if you want to know any more, do get in touch. I'm currently transcribing Will's diary, and in the autumn, that will hopefully be up on our website. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Georgina. That was extremely interesting. It's good to see illustration in an industrial context, and I wish you luck with trying to find out more about other examples of that. That's really interesting. That spiral staircase took me back to when I worked in the old Victorian Reference Library in Birmingham, where we had many such spiral staircases, very elaborate ones, which we had to climb up to fetch books in the good old days. Right, last but not least, our final speaker is Dr. Karen McAulay. She's a performing arts librarian and a postdoctoral researcher at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. She's currently preparing her second monograph to be published by Routledge, and her talk is on amateur music making and Scottish national identity, publishing music in Scotland 1880 to 1950. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you. I'm just going to find my screen. Let's share that. I'm assuming you can now see it since I can. Okay, my doctoral research and 2 postdoctoral grant opportunities concern Scottish music from the late 18th and 19th centuries, but the subsequent direction of my research was influenced by my dual identity as a librarian and a researcher. Music librarians receive donations with alarming regularity. I've waded through hundredweights of dusty bags in my time, with Scottish music quite often including in their contents. A handful of Scottish publishers' names and even particular titles emerged from those carrier bags again and again. Late Victorian industrial Glasgow was witnessing a population explosion, and the music trade was buoyant. Songbooks and dance tune collections varied from lavish volumes suitable for gifts to cheap mass-produced paper-covered books affordable for people from all walks of life, and this continued well into the 20th century. So, for example, this one in 1951 cost the rough equivalent of 2 McDonald's Happy Meals today. I wondered who the people were that published this material, what led them to start producing it in such vast quantities. And as for the purchasers, even if some were professional musicians or music teachers, the vast majority would have been amateurs. The contents give insights about amateur music making in that era and of the social history around popular entertainment and leisure activities. So with these questions in mind, I began to explore some of the key collections and the people behind them. I've made extensive use of the British Newspaper Archive and JSTOR. I've dallied in Ancestry. I've searched JISC, Library Hub, Discover and WorldCat with a diligence that honest students would gape at. And I've read the print off the covers and any introductory material or adverts that the books themselves contained. The pandemic can be blamed for my eBay acquisitions of anything I needed to see when I was working entirely from home. I've successfully pitched a book proposal with Routledge in the same series as my first monograph. I signed the contract just about a month ago. So I looked first at 2 of the cheaper publishers, James S. Kerr and Mozart Allen. In fact, Mozart Allen's father, a dancing teacher, named 3 sons after classical composers. Mozart's name and his dancing background were to stand him in good stead as a music publisher. Meanwhile, Kerr had been a master piano builder before launching into selling pianos and publishing music. This is a map showing the location of Kerr's shop at number 314 Paisley Road in Glasgow. The shop was a close neighbour to a hall that was used for social dancing and dancing classes. There were eventually 4 books of Kerr's now famous Merry Melodies, which you see in the picture on the right. The latter 2 were published after James Kerr himself had died, and he had another collection of reels and strathspeys, which was also popular. So this shows exactly what people were dancing to, but they also reflect other kinds of musical entertainments. If you've heard of the 19th century Christie's minstrels, thought at the time to have been a higher class of entertainment than music hall, then you'll understand how deeply unacceptable a small section of Kerr's second book is today. The history of blackface minstrelsy reveals the racist side of popular musical entertainment. Without finding these pages and occasional advertisements for other such publications, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to educate myself about something I had never encountered before, and neither would I have begun to understand some of the differences in approach to the matter on either side of the Atlantic. Having learned more about what plantations melodies actually meant, I've discovered a small but significant theme of this material, with a few titles also appearing in Mozart Allen's output, and again in a couple of highly popular student songbooks published by a firm called Bailey and Ferguson. It's not a high proportion of the material, but we have to acknowledge its presence. I think I've just gone away from the picture. Oh dear. Hang on, excuse me, folks. There we go. Late Victorian universities were almost exclusively white and male, as the student songbooks themselves attest. However, the books document more than this. We can note the preferred instruments of the day and the fact that social dancing entailed not only real strathspeys and jigs, but also waltzes from popular operas. And there's a batch of publications containing music to entertain children. Kerr's Guild of Play hints at a social movement that a modern musician would be completely unaware of. I believe the title, although it was published in Scotland, may have been influenced by a charitable organisation originating in Bermondsey. And I've been looking at other publishers' interest in educating school children in their national song heritage, and beginning to understand why the more serious classical composers tended to submit their work to the bigger, more mainstream English publishers instead. The most outstanding feature of the Scottish publishers' output was undeniably their Scottish repertoire. Many of the titles are confusingly very similar, and as I mentioned, they fell into different price brackets. Tartan-bound books would be advertised as ideal gifts at Christmas and New Year, and purchasers sometimes had the option of choosing a silk tartan of their chosen clan. Other cheaper books would have board or paper covers, but, as you see, still featuring tartan. Books were often gilt embossed and edged, and all the predictable symbolism would be extravagantly combined into covers: thistles, harps, Celtic knots, and the lion rampant of the Scottish royal crest. Similarly, there were many representations of Robert Burns, the national bard, his centenary in 1896 prompting more new publications. Sometimes there would be pictures of famous performers of Scottish songs, and in the 20th century, recorded celebrities were naturally emblazoned on book covers to help sell them. Scottish song and dance music is very much seen as cultural capital in Scotland. It's part of Scotland's national heritage and identity. The surge in emigration, whether to America, Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, created a demand around the diaspora for songs that would remind the emigrants of their roots. It has to be said that late Victorian and Edwardian Scottish and Irish songbooks contain quite a few songs of the emigrant's lament genre. I wish I hadn't left my home. I wish I hadn't left the girl behind me. I'd love to see the hills again, that kind of thing. So the realities of emigration voyages were grim, to say the least, and a homesick emigrant who had migrated out of economic necessity often had no chance of returning. The fact that the repertoire reflects the social history of its era, not to mention changing styles and musical settings themselves, does unfortunately mean much of this type of music is not going to be performed today, although songs by Robert Burns and a few other popular favourites will, of course, be perennial. Reels and strathspeys will always be popular, but not necessarily all the tunes in the older publications. But the value of these books is as much in their reflection of amateur music making and socialising, national pride, and an emigrant's links with their homeland, as in their musical content. The early 18th and 19th century repertoire is well documented. So now it's the turn of this later material. Mid-20th century scholars have dismissed it all as sentimental Scottish kitsch, the musical equivalent to Kailyard novels. And to a certain extent, I can see what they mean. But it still has its place in history, or there will be a gap when future generations try to make sense of Scotland's musical heritage. Hopefully my monograph will contribute to filling that gap. And for those watching me today, I hope that the next time you encounter an old Scottish music book, you'll look at it with slightly different eyes. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Karen. It was extremely interesting. And thank you to all our speakers again for a fantastic range of talks. I'm always amazed at the range of topics that we get in these seminars. And you know, we're only scratching the surface of the topic of the history of the printed image. There's so much more going on, or what's going on, that we could talk about. Let me just say before we start questions, the next of these webinars is on the 17th of November. If you're a member of HoPIN, you will get details of that. If you're not a member of HoPIN, I will in a second, when I finish speaking, put my email address in the chat box, and you can email me and you can join HoPIN, which doesn't cost you anything at all. We're having another Lightning Talks event sometime in 2023, because I've got a little list of people who wanted to give talks today but couldn't, because otherwise the talks would have been extremely lightning and not long enough to be able to say anything sensibly. So I kept a limit on, I didn't want more than 8 speakers in an hour or so, and we managed to stick to that. So, right, I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to look at the question and answer box, which has 5 questions and questions in, no answers yet. From Andrew McDonald Powney, Ines finished her talk with the laughter of fools, and I was just wondering why. Right,
Yeah.
Ines.
Yeah, thank you, John. I've already answered him in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right.
But it's actually an analogy with the Erasmus Text. And well, if we would have enough time and if we could analyze specific images, he used, you could see this, it's actually, he draw the you know, like this foolishness and laughter of people, and you can see people really enjoying in the madness of the carnival. So it's like, that is why I finished like that. Okay.
Right. Thank you very much. Question from Anne Coldiron. Hi, Anne. Nice to see you. Well, not see you, but to see your name anyway. Please excuse it if this question is ignorant. Rachel, has anyone tried making paper with the invasive species kudzu? Kudzu. Thank you for your talk.
Yes, no, thank you for that. Thank you for reading that question, John, and thank you for that question. And it's not you know, a silly question at all. It's a great question. Kudzu has actually been used to make paper as early as 1665. Anything with cellulose can actually be used to make paper, honestly. So yeah, it's been made paper. Artists such as just some of the other artists that make paper, a woman named Megan Hears, who has run something called the Invasive Paper Project. She does a lot with making paper with kudzu. So yes, it's actually quite more common than you think. So yeah, great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, wait a minute. I've just put my email address in the chat. And now I can see the chat and not the question. Hang on. Yeah, right. Ad Steinman, a question for Rachel. What options do you see for larger production of paper using invasive plants?
Thank you for these questions, guys. Yeah, no, so essentially, some might ask the question, well, do you want to make a market for something that you want to get rid of? But it's kind of naive, I think, to, imagine that we'd be able to get rid of all these invasives just because they are so rampant. So there has been a lot of research done into, different, what fibers might work best. And just in places like South Africa, I was reading that they're looking into the water hyacinth as one of the major plants that they would like to use, because, again, all plants, even though they could make paper, you want to find plants that have really long fiber lengths to get, have a nice strong sheet. So definitely very viable. And the research is being done to further this as we look for more sources for paper fiber. So yeah, great.
Yep, thank you very much. Question from David Solo. Another question for Rachel. Great talk, many thanks. You touched on it a bit, but I want to see if you could say more about how the content of your prints and books influences the exploration of alternative paper sources and vice versa. Are you searching for materials that will contribute to a particular project?
Oh, okay. Well, so this question, essentially, you want to. Sorry, I guess I didn't see this question earlier, so I'm as prepared, so I apologize. But no, I really think that I want to try to find papers, for my work that that are sustainable. Yeah, I don't know if that's not really answering your question, but no, I guess I'm always trying to, like, when I make my etchings, I always try to print make images that feature, if I'm printing on an invasive plant, I like to maybe make an image of the native plant make an etching of it. So yeah, but my contact information was on my PowerPoint. So if I'm not answering your questions fully, please feel free to reach out to me again, anybody for that. So
okay, thank you very much. I just realized I hadn't actually sent my email address to everybody. I'd sent it to one person by mistake. I think you should all have it in the chat box now. Now, have I got to on questions? Oh, we've got to the end of the question. No, we haven't. Sorry, one from Andrew McDonald Powney. In Cathy's talk, she shows a colophon from the end. I can't remember when the colophon shifted from end matter to front matter, can anyone help? And is it different in the UK and USA? Cathy?
I don't know.
No, I don't.
In Ishill's work, he stopped printing in 1966, and as far as I know, the colophons were always at the end. So he didn't change, and I kind of, my research stops right around that time, so I can't tell you.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of colophon is that it comes at the end. If it's at the beginning, it must be called something else, I think. Does anybody confirm that or otherwise? Paul's nodding wisely, so I assume
I think there's something about the word colophon that means it's a finishing touch.
It's at the end, yes.
It's derived from Greek, I think. It was once explained to me, and I can't quite remember the.
Yeah, same here. I've heard an explanation and can't remember it. All Greek to me. Any more questions, anyone? We have a bit of time left, but we didn't have to fill the time. We haven't had many questions for the last 6 speakers. They've nearly all been for Rachel and Ines so far. And Cathy. Any more questions? By the way, if speakers want to ask each other questions, I don't think you can actually type into the Q&A box for some strange reason with your panelist link. So if you want to just shout out a question to each other, feel free. If not, no.
I have
yes, Cathy.
All of you folks know a lot more about wood engraving than I do. I'm a political theorist. This is all new to me, but I really want to study the work of Louise Moreau, and I wondered if he is someone that is known to those of you who study the history of wood engraving.
Any offers I haven't come across.
I've also found a wood engraver named Ivy Ellis, and she was Havelock Ellis's daughter, the sexologist guy.
Right.
And another one named Bernard Slay, who was into fairies, you know, the Victorian sort of fairy in the garden thing. So I find these references to these interesting people who were doing this magnificent art, but I don't quite know how to look further.
Bernard Slay I've come across. I think he was a teacher of wood engraving, Bernard Slay. He taught somewhere in England, and I can't remember any more than that. It is a name I've come across.
Vaguely heard the name. I don't know. Anybody else offer anything? No. There are just so many people involved in all these things that it's difficult to track them all down and to find any substantial information about some of them. So good luck with trying to find something out. Any other? I think we might have another question in the box somewhere. Oh yeah, we've got a couple more now. So. Can we have the emails for each of the speakers? Yes, I think we've got time for all the speakers, if they would, to type their email into the chat box, please. If you're willing for people to email you directly. If not, or if we get a problem with that, I've put my address in. So if you want to contact anybody and can't, feel free to contact me and I will pass it on. Yes, good point. That was from Caroline Sloat. Kirsten Hardy, what was the title of the book by Mac? Who was Mac? Can't remember.
That was me.
That was Cathy, wasn't it? Yeah.
It's called How the Page Matters. Bonnie Mac.
Bonnie Mac, M-A-K, isn't it? Mac, I think.
M-A-K, that's right.
Yeah. And Cold Iron says she was unable to use the chat box for some reason. Probably a good thing, she said in bracket. So if you can't thank all the speakers and would like to thank them all somewhere here. So she's going to, and she's thanking me for creating HoPIN, which is very nice of her. Thank you. And if you're still there. Okay, any other questions? Also says another good book, Laurie McGuire, Rhetoric of the Page. I don't know that one. Laurie McGuire, Rhetoric of the Page. Okay. So we have got a few minutes left. If any, I'm not going to prolong it if we haven't got questions, but anybody want to ask a last question? Any of the speakers want to ask a question or say anything? not. I think everybody's done their bit and are ready to go and have something to eat or drink, or depending on what time of day or night it is, because you're all over the world. And I mean, it's here, it's 6:30 almost in the evening, but I don't know what it is where you are. So thank you all again very much. We've had some excellent talks. We've had such a great variety. Thank you again, as always, to the University of Wolverhampton for hosting these. Tonight we were looked after by Luke, who has been behind the scenes, but has been helping us out with the technical side of things, especially with Brian's slides. So thank you for that, Luke, and for your input. Thank you to Wolverhampton for that. So we'll see you again maybe on the 17th of November for the next one, and there'll be another of the Lightning Talks events sometime in 2023. We have one of these events roughly every 2 months. You know, keep an eye on HoPIN, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you all once again, and enjoy the rest of your day or morning or night or whatever. Thank you.
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.